I stared at my phone, frozen, as the words sank in. Don't come to the wedding. You and your kids just make things awkward. My chest tightened, a cold weight settling over me, and for a moment, I couldn't even breathe. I read the message again, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, but every word was there, sharp and undeniable. My mother had never been subtle with her disdain, but this was public, deliberate, and cruel. Memories began to flood me, uninvited yet relentless. I remembered every birthday she ignored, every holiday where my cousin was lavished with gifts while my children got scraps. I remembered the whispered comments at family gatherings, the way she always compared me to my cousin as if I were nothing more than a cautionary tale. Even now, the sting was fresh, as if decades of small betrayals had condensed into this single, cutting sentence. My children, blissfully unaware, played at the foot of the couch, their laughter a painful reminder of how I'd failed to shield them from this constant exclusion. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the trembling in my hands, trying to find some rational explanation, some reason why my own mother would humiliate me this way, but there wasn't one. The pattern had always been clear: favoritism, judgment, and emotional cruelty wrapped in the guise of maternal concern. My mind raced through the long list of slights I'd suffered, each one a thread weaving the tapestry of rejection that had defined my life in her eyes. And yet, beneath the hurt, a quiet, simmering anger began to form, a resolve I hadn't felt before. I wouldn't let this message define the rest of my story. Something had to change, and I knew deep down that this was the spark I needed. The humiliation stung, but it also lit a fire. My mother thought she could control me with a few cold words, but I was learning that power could be reclaimed, even in the face of the people who should have loved me the most. I looked at my kids again, their little faces innocent and trusting, and I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about showing them, and showing myself, that we deserved better than to be treated like outsiders in our own family. That single text, meant to wound, had unintentionally become the beginning of something entirely different. A plan, a purpose, a path forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, knowing that the next chapter wouldn't be written by my mother's cruel hand, but by my own. I can still see it all, like a series of painful snapshots burned into my memory. Birthday parties where my cousin received a towering cake adorned with every decoration imaginable, while I sat quietly in a corner with my kids, clutching a modest cupcake as if our presents didn't matter. Holidays were no better. Thanksgiving dinners where the family toasted achievements I didn't have the chance to celebrate. Christmas mornings where extravagant gifts were lavished on her, and we received little more than perfunctory smiles. Every gathering carried the same unspoken message: we didn't belong, we weren't enough. I remember the way relatives would glance at my children with polite sympathy, as if to say, poor things, they'll never measure up. The whispers in the kitchen, the side glances during conversations, the subtle comparisons to the golden child, who had never done anything wrong in their eyes. It all accumulated like a constant, gnawing ache. My kids began to sense it too. At one holiday dinner, my daughter asked why her cousin's gift was bigger and brighter than hers, and I had no satisfying answer. I wanted to scream that the size of a present didn't define love, but the truth was, it did define how our family saw us. That invisible wall separating us from acceptance and celebration wasn't just physical, it was emotional. And it left scars I could feel every time I looked at my children, hoping to shield them but realizing I couldn't. Every public humiliation, every subtle slight, had compounded into a deep reservoir of resentment that I carried silently. I replayed these moments in my mind over and over, imagining what it would feel like to turn the tables, to be seen, to finally belong in a family that had spent so long treating us as outsiders. The FOMO wasn't just a fleeting pang. It was a relentless shadow over every holiday, every birthday, every family photo where our absence, or our diminished presence, spoke louder than any words. And as I sat there, recalling each overlooked milestone, the bitterness mingled with a budding determination. I refused to let decades of exclusion define our worth. Each forgotten birthday and ignored holiday had become fuel, preparing me for a reckoning that was long overdue, and I promised myself that one day, the script would be flipped entirely. The invitation itself arrived like a declaration of war. Though dressed in gold foil and scripted calligraphy, my mother's voice carried over the phone as she casually mentioned the cousin's upcoming wedding, her tone dripping with pride, as if she were showcasing a prized possession. The venue was a historic estate, a sprawling mansion that barely fit the guest list, and the budget she boasted about could have funded our entire year of necessities. Every detail she rattled off. Designer dresses for bridesmaids, a string quartet flown in from Europe, a weekend retreat for family members who were worthy, only deepened the chasm I already felt. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The extravagance, the meticulous planning, the sheer visibility of it all. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a statement of status, a broadcasted affirmation of who was important and who wasn't. And then it hit me, the implicit exclusion. My name, my children, invisible on every list, every seating arrangement, every carefully orchestrated moment. The rejection wasn't subtle. It was carved into every aspect of the celebration before it even began. I felt my stomach twist, a mix of disbelief and simmering anger. How could the people who were supposed to love and accept us make such a spectacle out of exclusion? The gulf between accepted and rejected yawned wider with each passing second as I imagined the cousin basking in attention, showered with gifts, accolades, and admiration, while we were left to navigate the invisible margins. I realized with a cold clarity that this wedding wasn't simply about union. It was about power, hierarchy, and visibility. And for the first time, I began to see our absence not just as personal rejection, but as a weapon, a public statement meant to humiliate. Yet, amid the shock and disbelief, a tiny ember of defiance flickered inside me. If they wanted to flaunt superiority, they were about to learn that exclusion can be the spark that ignites a reckoning. And no lavish celebration could hide the truth of who we really were. Less real. Don't come to the wedding. You and your kids just make things awkward. Each word landed like a stone in my chest, and I could feel the sting spreading to the tips of my fingers. My children, playing innocently nearby, sensed my tension and looked up with curious eyes, and suddenly the humiliation was doubled. I wasn't just rejected. They were too. I imagined them hearing the echoes of that exclusion in whispers, in sideways glances, in the polite sympathy of relatives who had always treated them like outsiders. My mind raced, replaying every moment where this pattern had been evident. Overlooked birthdays, forgotten achievements, casual remarks comparing them to the golden child. The realization that my kids were inheriting my own shame twisted in my stomach. How could a single text carry so much power, so much cruelty, yet so little accountability? I felt anger, yes, but also a deep, aching sadness, the kind that sinks into your bones when you recognize a lifelong pattern of favoritism and dismissal. And beneath it all, a quiet, simmering determination began to form, a whisper in my head telling me that this exclusion, this attempt to diminish us, would not define our story. By the time we arrived at the next family gathering, the tension was already thick in the air. Even before we stepped through the door, I could hear the faint murmur of voices, low and pointed, as if rehearsed to sting. "Did you hear she actually brought the kids?" one relative whispered, barely disguising their smirk. "I guess some people just don't know their place," another added, and I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. My children clung to my side, sensing my unease, and I tried to smile, though every word was a knife twisting inside. I remembered previous gatherings where similar whispers had followed me, echoes of exclusion I had learned to internalize. The dinner table at Christmas, the snide comment about my modest gift compared to my cousin's extravagant present, the casual remark about how I never measured up in school or career, they all came flooding back. I caught a cousin glancing at me with that familiar pitying smile, and it reminded me of the countless times I had swallowed my frustration to keep peace. Yet hearing it out loud now, in real time, made the humiliation sharper, immediate. I thought of the silent sacrifices I had made for this family, the way I had shielded my children from petty cruelty, only to have it thrust in our faces anyway. The whispers, the side comments, the carefully calibrated judgment. It was a performance designed to establish hierarchy, to remind everyone who was worthy and who was not. And in that moment, I understood the social stakes clearly. We were outsiders, expected to stand quietly while the golden child soaked up attention and approval. But I also felt a flicker of something different. Anger, yes, but clarity too. I would remember every slight, every whispered word, and when the time came, I would rewrite the rules of this gathering, and everyone that followed. After leaving that gathering, I sat in my car, the city lights casting long shadows across the dashboard, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to stop feeling small. The humiliation and whispered judgments had lit a fire I couldn't ignore. I began running scenarios in my head, thinking not about revenge in the petty sense, but about reclaiming the power and respect that had always been denied to me. I made a list, scribbled on the margins of a notebook, opportunities to grow, people who could become allies, ways to quietly build leverage without alerting the family to my intentions. I thought about the business I'd poured my energy into over the years, the deals that had quietly succeeded while they dismissed me as incapable or irrelevant. Every contract, every connection became a tool, a way to establish a presence they couldn't ignore. I considered old friends who had been overlooked or underappreciated by the family, those who could provide both social support and influence if approached strategically. The plan didn't need to be loud or immediate. Subtlety was key. I would create a reputation, a quiet ascent that they would only realize existed when it was too late to stop it. My children became part of the vision too. Not pawns, but reminders of what I was defending and building. With every mental sketch of the steps ahead, the sting of exclusion transformed into motivation. Each decision was deliberate, each connection a seed for the inevitable reversal of fortune. And as I looked at the notebook, now covered in notes, timelines, and potential alliances, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration, knowing that for the first time, the next move wasn't dictated by their cruelty, but by my own determination and strategy. It happened sooner than I expected. Out of nowhere, a cousin I barely knew reached out, a quiet ally I hadn't anticipated. "I've always thought they treated you unfairly," she said over coffee, her voice low and earnest. She had witnessed years of favoritism and subtle humiliation, but had never spoken up until now. Her support felt like a lifeline, validation I hadn't realized I desperately needed. Together, we brainstormed small ways to assert presence without making waves, attending minor family events with confidence, highlighting achievements that had long been ignored, subtly reminding others of my successes. Each little win, whether it was a nod of recognition from a distant relative or a business accomplishment casually mentioned at a gathering, became a tiny crack in the armor of their assumed superiority. For the first time in years, I felt the scales begin to tip, a quiet shift in power that no one expected. The exhilaration of being seen, of claiming my space, was intoxicating. It wasn't about gloating or revenge yet. It was about reclaiming dignity, and with that dignity came a newfound courage. I realized that their underestimation had become my advantage, a blind spot I could exploit. That small reversal, subtle but undeniable, set the stage for bigger moves, and for the first time, I felt like the architect of my own story, rather than a passive character in theirs. I arrived at the estate long before the ceremony, blending into the shadows as if I were nothing more than a ghost passing through someone else's celebration. From a distance, I watched the elaborate decorations, the perfectly arranged tables, and the guests arriving in shimmering gowns and tailored suits. Every detail was a statement of wealth, influence, and painfully exclusion. My stomach churned with humiliation, knowing my children would not be walking those halls, smiling under the spotlight, or being praised for anything. And yet, I stayed hidden, letting them believe we were irrelevant, letting their arrogance grow. My mind raced, recalling all the birthdays, the forgotten holidays, the whispered slights that had brought me here. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, sharp and unrelenting, but alongside it grew a quiet, steely resolve. I observed their confidence, their laughter, their assumption that I would remain on the sidelines, and I knew they had no idea how underestimated I was. Every smile, every toast, every carefully choreographed moment of grandeur was a reminder of what they thought they had won, and that assumption, that I was powerless, was my advantage. I would use it. The cliffhanger hovered in my chest. They believed this day belonged to them entirely, unaware that I was already plotting my quiet ascendance, ready to turn this celebration of exclusion into the prelude of their own surprise. The fire inside me burned hotter as I watched, unnoticed but calculating, every misjudgment they made adding fuel to the reckoning I knew was coming. The moment arrived during the wedding reception. Under the glittering chandeliers and the soft hum of the string quartet, I stepped forward, subtly commanding attention without anyone realizing it at first. As the cousin laughed and the mother preened, I casually mentioned a recent business acquisition, the kind of deal that no one in the family knew I had. Orchestrated, an investment that had quietly doubled my financial standing and positioned me as a formidable player in social circles they thought I could never enter. Eyes widened, barely perceptible at first, as I revealed, almost in passing, the inheritance stipulations that granted my children rights they had assumed were long denied. Gasps rippled through the room, subtle yet undeniable, and I watched their carefully constructed facade of superiority falter. I detailed my recent successes, framed with a calm confidence, highlighting the irony that every snide comment, every act of exclusion, had overlooked the quiet power I had been building. The cousin's laughter stumbled, turning nervous. My mother's poise faltered, her eyes betraying a flicker of disbelief and discomfort. Guests exchanged glances, murmurs spreading like wildfire as the invisible barriers of status and dominance began to crumble. I felt a surge of vindication, a rush of empowerment, knowing that the small, calculated moves I had made over the months had led to this moment. It wasn't loud, not theatrical yet, but the shift was undeniable. For the first time, the family realized that their assumptions of weakness, of invisibility, were catastrophically wrong. The twist wasn't just in the revelation of money or legal advantage. It was in the quiet, undeniable assertion of power that left them scrambling to comprehend how they had misjudged me so completely. I approached the bridal suite under the guise of offering a simple congratulations, my heart hammering in my chest. My mother looked up, feigning surprise, while my cousin smiled condescendingly, her eyes sparkling with self-satisfaction. "I didn't expect to see you here," my mother said, her tone clipped, as if my presence were a disruption to her perfect day. I forced a calm smile, letting the anger simmer just beneath the surface. "I thought it was only polite to stop by," I replied, my voice steady, measured, belying the storm inside me. The cousin tilted her head, as if assessing whether I belonged, unaware that the very achievements she had ignored had elevated me far beyond her expectations. I let the silence stretch, watching their expressions shift subtly, sensing the first flickers of unease, though they didn't know why. I reminded them of my children's accomplishments, of years of overlooked efforts, of sacrifices made quietly while they reveled in the spotlight. Every word was deliberate, each sentence a needle threading into the fabric of their assumptions. I watched my mother's face tighten, a barely perceptible twitch betraying her discomfort, while my cousin's smile faltered ever so slightly. Neither realized that the foundation they had built on the illusion of my weakness was already cracking. I left them with polite nods, exiting with grace, but inside the tension had shifted. The confrontation was subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer, but it marked the first undeniable ripple of change. Their underestimation was becoming my advantage, and the storm I had been quietly preparing was ready to gather force. The room fell into a sudden hush as I raised my glass for an impromptu toast, every eye now drawn to me, including my mother's and cousins, who had never imagined I would claim the spotlight. I began speaking, voice steady but charged with emotion, recounting quietly the years of overlooked efforts, small victories that had gone unnoticed, and sacrifices made for the very family that had tried to diminish us. Each sentence was deliberate, highlighting contrasts they had ignored, the difference between appearance and reality, between assumed weakness and the power I had quietly accumulated. I mentioned achievements that no one had expected, subtly weaving in the recent business deal and the inheritance clause, framing them as proof of perseverance, intelligence, and the fairness of karma. Guests began murmuring, the weight of the revelation sinking in as glances flickered between disbelief and awe. My cousin's confident posture faltered, and my mother's lips pressed into a tight line, her pride shaken in the quietest, most devastating way. This was no outburst, no dramatic spectacle, but a precise, undeniable statement. The overlooked, the underestimated, had quietly become unassailable. As I spoke, I saw the recalibration in their eyes, A recognition that the social hierarchy they had assumed was now inverted. My children's faces lit up, their pride evident, and I felt a rush of validation, knowing that I had transformed humiliation into empowerment, exclusion into triumph. By the time I lowered my glass, the energy in the room had shifted irreversibly. The family realized that underestimating me had been their greatest mistake, and the quiet, strategic ascent I had executed was more satisfying than any explosive confrontation could have been. In that moment, standing tall among whispers and astonished stares, I understood that vindication didn't always need spectacle. It thrived in the subtle, undeniable revelation of truth and earned respect. Sitting with my children in the quieter corner of the reception, I finally allowed myself to breathe, the tension that had built over months slowly easing. Their laughter, mingling with whispered congratulations from a few supportive relatives, felt like music I hadn't heard in years. I thought back to the countless holidays, birthdays, and family events where they had been sidelined, their excitement dimmed by the invisible walls of favoritism. Comparing those memories to this moment, the smiles on their faces, the way guests now sought them out to celebrate achievements that had long been ignored, I felt a swell of pride and empowerment unlike anything I had experienced before. The moral satisfaction was profound. Years of patience, strategy, and quiet determination had transformed humiliation into recognition. For once, my children were not just witnesses to injustice, but participants in triumph, embraced and celebrated openly. The echoes of past rejection, once heavy and suffocating, now served as a backdrop that made this victory even sweeter. I traced the journey in my mind, from feeling invisible and dismissed to standing tall, seeing my family acknowledge not just me, but the strength and value of my children. The room seemed lighter, warmer, infused with a sense of justice finally realized. It wasn't revenge in the bitter sense, but a reclaiming of dignity, a rewriting of the narrative that had once sought to erase us. And as I watched my kids beam with pride, I knew that the lessons of endurance, strategy, and self-respect were theirs to carry forward, a shield against any future attempt to diminish us. The days following the wedding were a strange mix of tension, admiration, and quiet recalibration within the family. Some relatives approached me with hesitant apologies, their voices tinged with awe as they admitted they had underestimated me and my children. Others avoided eye contact, their pride bruised, the consequences of years of favoritism and dismissal finally surfacing. My mother remained distant, her silence heavy with unspoken recognition, while my cousin's forced politeness barely masked her discomfort. Despite the awkwardness, I felt a sense of moral satisfaction I had never experienced before, the subtle, undeniable justice of having our worth finally acknowledged. Invitations and acknowledgments that had once been denied arrived in small gestures, a congratulatory note, a smile, or an inclusion in a family photo. My children, now celebrated instead of sidelined, laughed freely, unaware of the intricate dance of power and strategy that had allowed this reversal. It was a reminder that karma doesn't always strike with loud spectacle. Sometimes it moves quietly, weaving patience, perseverance, and smart choices into its course. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, thinking about the years of exclusion, the whispered slights, and the quiet indignities we had endured. And yet, the triumph was sweeter because it had been earned, crafted through calculated resilience rather than anger. The family dynamic had shifted irreversibly, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of vindication and emotional relief settle around me. Alone later that evening, I let myself reflect on everything that had unfolded. The years of exclusion, the whispers, the silent comparisons to my cousin. All of it had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I thought about my children, their laughter echoing in the empty rooms, and realized that the lessons I had learned through pain were now theirs too. Resilience, strategy, and self-respect. I understood that family doesn't always mean unconditional support. Sometimes it teaches you how to stand tall when others try to diminish you. Pride and empowerment mingled with a quiet sense of forgiveness. Not for them, but for myself, to release the bitterness I had carried for far too long. I recognized the subtle beauty of karma, of patience, and of measured action, and how those principles had restored balance without losing dignity. In that reflective silence, I felt a full circle emotional release, knowing that exclusion had been transformed into triumph, humiliation into confidence, and betrayal into wisdom. And as I closed my eyes, I allowed a deep, cathartic satisfaction to settle in my chest. The story wasn't just about revenge, it was about growth, justice, and the undeniable strength of standing for yourself when no one else would.